You may find this very hard to believe, but I have to begin the first conference this morning on David Copperfield with a rant. When His Excellency asked me about ordering editions so they would be available for people to read, I fell back on old habits. Habit is a good thing, especially if they're good habits. And for years, as a teacher of English literature, when the time came to order books, I could always fall back on the old reliable Penguin classics. For decades, Penguin has been putting out good, inexpensive paperback versions of the classics, from the Greeks up to recent classics. And you could depend on them. Fairly well put together, solid introductions, easy to read. Well, the first thing I've got to say, it's been a few years since I've taught Copperfield, so the last time I ordered it, I got the previous edition, and I assume that was what was still available. Instead, there's a new edition that came out recently. First thing to notice, the print is so small as to be nearly unreadable. I should have caught on to that because I taught A Tale of Two Cities to my students last spring, and noticed that the print was getting tinier and tinier in the Penguin classics, and I put it down to my eyesight going. Age comes on and we go blind and deaf and the rest of it, probably with good cause. But no, it turns out this is what they're doing. I don't know why they're doing it, but the print is getting smaller. It's not easy to read. And then it was only after I picked up a copy of the new edition I realized how absolutely hideous the introduction is. My own profession of English literature has been destroyed. There is virtually no school left in America, with the possible exception of Boston University, where one can go and still study literature. It has been taken over by maniacs. It's been taken over by, my generation. I can't apologize for all of them. But the lunacy of the late 60s, where they went through and thought they learned something in school and got degrees, unleashed them on literature departments, and they have simply destroyed the study of literature. Best example that I can pull out is that if you go as an English major to a modern university, there is only a 27% chance you will be required to read one Shakespeare play. No course in Shakespeare, maybe read one play, 27% chance, if you're an English major. That's what it's come down to. There's just plain obscenity. Just plain obscenity in the introduction to David Copperfield. I don't know what to say. It's come to the point where parents are now going to have to check introductions to versions of the classics before they buy them for their kids. Who knows what they've done to Treasure Island? Who knows what they've done to Kim? Who knows what they've done to, you name it, 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea? It's difficult to say. But if they can hire a lunatic to write the insane introduction to this new edition of David Copperfield, they're capable of anything. I will read one sentence for you. This is not the obscenity. Well, this is mental obscenity. Our author, who has a prestigious position at blah blah U. This is 11 XI in the intro near the top of the page. It's just absurd. It's about the 6th sentence down. Deconstructive criticism suggests that writing, by deferring meaning, dissolves both the subject who is writing and the subject of writing. Number one, you don't know what they're talking about. But if we can make a guess at what this idiot is saying, he seems to be saying that we write in order to put off meaning. And in putting off meaning, the writer disappears, and the whole idea of writing disappears. So by writing, we get rid of writing and the writer. That's going on out there now. It's just, so I apologize. I did not know. And while I'm ranting against Penguin classics, for 50 years, they published the only version of Don Quixote in English that was readable. It's by a man named J.M. Cohen, C-O-H-E-N. Find it. You can still find it in some bookstores. They've put a new one out. They hired a new translator. It's terrible. You can't read it. I'm not going to be able to teach Quixote anymore. The one readable translation they've dropped in favor of, again, well, I don't know if he's a lunatic, but he can't translate. So get to your bookstore, find the old Penguin Don Quixote. It's been available from 1950 till 2002. So there's a good chance it's floating around in used bookstores or elsewhere. It's not just that it's readable. I don't know who Mr. Cohen was, but he has a sense of humor and delivers the jokes. And Don Quixote without the humor isn't Don Quixote. And the new translator is an academic with no sense of humor, and he's put out an unreadable Don Quixote that is not funny. Avoid it at all costs. That's my rant against Penguin Classics. Unnecessary. A warning to parents. If you go to a bookstore, you must now check the books, check the introductions, check the size of the print, look over the book. That's what we've come to. It's heartbreaking. Now, with that rather grim beginning, not unlike the start of David Copperfield's life, we go on to happier things. I have to reminisce just for a moment because this is the first great book I ever read. And this really was the book that set me on the road of good reading. There was, I received a letter after the book on Bishop de Castro Mayor came out from a very elderly nun in California. She was in an old folks' home, basically, and said that she found it difficult to read now because of her eyes. She had always loved reading, but she had made it through my book and was very complimentary and very kind. But at the end, she had a little sentence that I treasure, which said, "You have obviously spent a lifetime in the lap of Our Lady of Good Reading." And it's a very nice place to be. And if I did, it's thanks first of all to my mother, who read to me over and over and over again and got me in the habit of reading. And then number two, a great teacher. I've mentioned her before. In fact, I mentioned her when I did the Merchant of Venice lecture. Her name was Marie Cal. And a great teacher who saw I was a reader. But at that point, all I was reading was murder mysteries. I was in 8th grade. Every Perry Mason, every Agatha Christie, any murder mystery I could get my hands. I read them by the hundreds. That had grown out of reading the Hardy Boy books. And she managed to slip me a Jules Verne novel, which was pretty good. I enjoyed that. And then handed me David Copperfield, and my life changed. What she knew, and I think it's a simple fact, is that there is an element of sheer delight in reading Dickens that if you can connect with will make you a reader for life. And my love of Dickens has never left me. My love of David Copperfield in particular is strong, and I do believe it's Dickens' greatest novel. In fact, he admitted it was his favorite. This is from the preface in 1867, when they put out all of his works collected. It was the first Charles Dickens edition, and there was really only one more book to come. And he does a new introduction in that preface. He says at the end, I think this is quite wonderful, it would concern the reader little, perhaps, to know how sorrowfully the pen is laid down at the close of a 2 years imaginative task. He wrote the book over the space of 2 years. Or how an author feels as if he were dismissing some portion of himself into the shadowy world, when a crowd of the creatures of his brain are going from him forever. Yet I had nothing else to tell, unless indeed I were to confess, which might be of less moment still, that no one can ever believe this narrative in the reading more than I believed it in the writing. It's a wonderful, wonderful statement. And it tells us something about the nature of the imaginative act. Dickens somehow was able to move into that world completely and believe it. and set it down as if he were putting down reality, which he isn't, and I'll talk about that in a moment. We have a different kind of illusory art here, but very different, and different for a different reason. Come back to that in a moment. So true are these avowals at the present day that I can now only take the reader into one confidence more. Of all my books, I like this the best. It will be easily believed that I am a fond parent to every child of my fancy, and that no one can ever love that family as dearly as I love them. But like many fond parents, I have in my heart of hearts a favorite child, and his name is David Copperfield. It's a lovely statement. And Dickens' love for the book tells us something, I think, about his joy in writing it, the intensity of what he went through in the experience of writing it, but also the fact this is the most autobiographical of the novels. I'm not going to spend a great deal of time writing about the biography of Dickens. Along the way, I'll touch on some things, but let me just say simply, he began as a fairly impoverished child. His father was somewhat improvident. His father is portrayed in this novel quite gently and with great love as Dickens' greatest comic creation. Wilkins Micawber, Esquire, is a picture of Dickens' father, and I'll come back to that when I talk about the great Micawber, but it's a portrait of what Dickens' own father was like. It was a difficult life, but early success came to him. He was a court reporter, took up the job of journalist, and was at the Court of Chancery, and became well known. He had a pen name, Boz, B-O-Z, and he became well known because he could give very quick, very accurate, and memorable sketches of what went on in the courtroom. He, from the beginning of his career, had an ability toward portraiture in words, being able to give a character and sum up a scene. Very, very special gift. And he was so good at it. In fact, Sketches by Boz is his first book. It's a collection of his courtroom reporting. And then a publisher was putting out a book of hunting sketches, basically illustrations, and they wanted someone to write an accompanying text for the illustrations. What happened is they hired Dickens, and he began writing and created an imaginary club who hunted as part of their adventures, and out came what we now know as the Pickwick Papers, Mr. Pickwick and his friends. And almost overnight it became a sensation. Dickens was 22 years old and became the most famous man in England. It sold like hotcakes. And the reason it sold so well is it remains an absolutely delightful book. But he was able to do what he did because he had absorbed great literature from the past. We'll look at the scene later in Copperfield where he finds the books in the attic. That happened to Dickens. He found a stack of old books and just lost himself in them. But as a result, he knew Quixote backwards and forwards. He knew the Smollett novels, Roderick Random and such. He knew the Fielding novels, Tom Jones. And so when it came time and he started writing something that turned into a novel, almost by happenstance, he was a master. And the Pickwick Papers, from the get-go, his first novel, is an absolute masterpiece and remains one of the most delightful books ever written. Well, the reading public agreed. And they fell in love with it, and they couldn't get enough Dickens. It's very funny, but so the fact that this is his favorite just means it's one of a great number of beloved books, and books that are a joy to read. I had a friend in high school whose father worked at a tire company. He read one book a year. And every year he read David Copperfield. He read no other book. Once a year he sat down, he reread David Copperfield. And he told me this once, and I said to him, well, you know, Dickens wrote many other very delightful novels I'm sure you would enjoy. He said, oh yes, I'm sure I would enjoy them, but I love this one. So for his whole life, once a year, he read one book, and it was David Copperfield. One could do much worse. As I say to my students, don't leave this earth without having read David Copperfield, just for the sheer joy of knowing those people and going along with the story. Very funny. My brother's not a reader, but I occasionally foist books off on him. And I remember when I handed him Copperfield, and he sort of looked at the length of it and page 2. Then I realized, he was hiding out in his room for a while, and it became clear he was reading Copperfield. And then I saw him. He was moping one day. I said, "What's wrong?" He said, "I finished David Copperfield." I said, "Well, what's?" He said, "I feel awful." I said, "Why do you feel awful?" He said, "It's done. It's finished." It's what Dickens says about that whole world, all those people you've come to love, just somehow leaving you. He creates a real world. And you move in, you become part of, you know these people. You live with them. It's an extraordinary gift. Now, the other thing you have to understand is that, and this is very important, understanding Dickens. Let me emphasize this because I did something very unfair, and I apologize for it. I forced you through this book at high speed. Dickens was meant to be read lingeringly. Dickens wrote in a world where there was still time. Time is denied us. We live in an age when everything is speeding up, and we live in a country that only appreciates the active virtues, which means you've always got to be out there doing something, and you better do it fast. That's not what a long novel is about. A long novel is about having the time, the space, the breath, and the quiet to sit down and read a little bit of it and reflect on it and then read a little bit again. It did indeed take Dickens 2 years to write the book, and it took him that long to see it published. The Pickwick Papers was published serially. A segment would come out every month. And that's the way all the Dickens novels appeared. Again, you'll notice, for those of you that have the Penguin Classics, they promise at the beginning that they will mark off the little monthly installments. So every 3 or 4 chapters, there are those 3 dots at the end. And those dots tell you where the monthly installments stop. Now, they miss 3 of them. For those of you that have the Penguin, you might want to write this down. They miss page 503, page 706, and page 748. There are ends of installments on those pages that don't get marked, but then the publishing companies don't have editors anymore. It's a miracle the words are, some of them, printed with proper spelling. In any case, why is it important? Well, part of what you have to understand is what Dickens would do, and I'll look at this later as I go through the novel. Dickens would shape the material so that not only is he creating this vast architectural sketch of an 800-page novel. That's a long piece of literature. And I'll try to show as we begin that he has already planned it out from the start so that he has the ending in mind. He has shaped out the whole thing, but he also has to design each unit of it, because each monthly unit has to be designed and particularly do 2 things. 1, it's got to somehow remind the reader what happened in the previous month, make that link, because there would have been a month's delay. Now, admittedly, what happened is people would get that monthly installment and read it over and over and over again. It was, if you will, what they did in lieu of television in the evening. Family would gather together, the father would sit and read to the family the latest monthly installment of the new Dickens novel. And not just once, but many times over. There is a wonderful story told by the American novelist Henry James. David Copperfield, the new Dickens novel, started arriving in America, and his father made the decision that young Henry was too young to stay up that late and join the rest of the family in hearing David Copperfield read. And Henry was just devastated. So what he did, and he says he felt terribly guilty about it, was a measure of how he had to hear this book. He would allow his parents to put him in bed and pretend to go to sleep instantly. And then as quietly as he could, crawl out of the bed, open the door, and crawl along the upper banister and lie with his ear cocked toward where his father was reading. He said he heard the whole book read that way. So it's a wonderful vision, though, of how intense the experience was and how much it meant to people. And the other thing it had to do then, of course, you're too young. You don't remember the Saturday matinee movies. I'd pay $0.25 when I was a kid, double feature. newsreel, cartoon, but they always had a serial at the beginning. And it would go on for 12 weeks or something. And it would always end quite literally with a cliffhanger. It gets the name because it ended with somebody dangling off a cliff. Then you have to wait till next week to find out if that person fell. That person never fell, but still, it was to keep your attention so you'd come back the next week. Dickens does that at the end of each monthly installment. He has shaped it so we end on a note of anticipation. It is good novel writing. It is good business sense. It means people are going to buy the next month's installment. Well, they would have done that anyway, probably. But the other wonderful thing, and I need to emphasize this, it tells us something about the nature of storytelling, which is at the heart of storytelling is the question of what happens next. Narrative, I go back to Aristotle. It sounds so basic as to be foolish, and I won't go into a long disquisition on this, but let me make the point again because it cannot be made too often. If a tragedy is the imitation of an action which is complete in itself and has a beginning and a middle and an end, it suggests that there is order and structure to narrative, that a story has to be crafted. It starts somewhere, it goes somewhere, it ends somewhere. What Dickens is doing with each of the little monthly segments is saying there is more to come, and what happens next is very important. We are moving towards some sort of endpoint and resolution, but as we move through it, in the story, as in life, we can't know how it's going to end up. Not one of us in this room knows how or when we will die and face our Maker in judgment, but we know it's going to happen. And an observer from the outside who will see it all will have a sense of where we came from, how we lived, and how we died. That is completeness. And it suggests that there is a design to the life. Modern literature insists on circularity. Works end where they began. I could give you a long... Joyce's Finnegan's Wake, the plays of Beckett, plays of Ionesco, it just over and over and over again we find this. It's the modernist pose, and what it says is there is no meaning. It's the, again, Aristotelian notion of teleology. You cannot define a thing until you have some sense of its end. It is the end that gives us the ability to understand definition and define in some way. If there is no end, if it's not going anywhere, then it has no purpose. If it doesn't end, it can never finally have any design. It's the difference between Dickens and the soap opera. As the World Turns has been, no, The Guiding Light. Let's say The Guiding Light has been on for 50-some years. I remember watching it with my grandmother who died in 1968. It's still going on. 5 days a week, all those years, it's been telling an endless story. It is meaningless because it cannot end until it'll go off the air someday. But the story's not shaped. There's no design. There's no purpose. What there is that sense, and they're playing off this desire of the viewer, what happens next, what comes next, then what happens, which is ingrained in us because what happens next is important. Let me point out as well, this is a Catholic instinct. This is not a Protestant instinct. It's the reason why there have been very few Protestant storytellers. The telling of stories is Catholic. The Protestant vision that you live, you have one defining moment, and then you're covered for the rest of your days, really defies storytelling. I was a sinner. I was born again. Now I'm saved, and I'm saved till the end. That has one incident, one important incident. The rest is of very little importance. I hadn't thought of this to now, but it may be indeed the reason, that vision, that what we find now in art, and I call it bad art, is just one thing happening after another without any connection. It's that vision of the explosive incident in the film, or the erotic incident in the film. Just a moment, another moment, with no design, no coherence. What we have here is design, beginning, middle, end narrative. It's going somewhere. It is dependent on what came before. It's looking forward to things that may happen in the future. And please notice as well, those things that may happen in the future have a range of possibilities before them. It can go in any of a number of different directions, which means there is a sense of freedom and freedom of choice in the art form. There are moments in the novel when David makes disastrous choices. There are moments when he makes good choices. When he is making bad choices, we are fearful. When he finally makes some good choices, we applaud him. When he finally, at the end of the book, does that which we know he should have done 400 pages earlier, we cheer and the book can come to its ending place. We knew it. Aunt Betsy knew it. Everybody around him has known it, but he's so dense he himself hasn't known it, and it takes... Ask your friends. They'll tell you how you should be living your life. It is somehow easier from the outside, and he has to make that choice on his own. But there we go. So we have that kind of design within the work, and it's one reason that the readers loved it, and they would hang on every monthly episode. It gave social unity, of course. Everybody was reading it. Everybody was reading it. And not just in England. They would ship them over to America as fast as the boats could get there. My favorite story was when the Old Curiosity Shop was being published. It was nearing the end. And at the end of the previous episode, I'm not giving anything away here. If you don't know this, you could have heard it 100 times anyway. It's a classic moment in Dickens. Little Nell in the Old Curiosity Shop is lying dying, and it's not clear if she's going to live or die. The next installment was written, it was printed, it was coming from London to Boston Harbor. And a mob of thousands of people showed up at the docks, waiting for the boat to arrive with the next episode to find out if Little Nell was alive or dead. But of course, as the boat pulled into the harbor, the sailors on the boat had already read the installment. So the people on the dock are shouting, "Is she alive? Is she alive?" And the sailors were hanging over the rails of the ship, weeping, shouting, "She is dead. She is dead." And there was pandemonium on the docks. I mean, we look back with, it is humorous, but it gives you a sense of social unity and how incredibly important Dickens as a storyteller was to people in the 19th century. Now, the other thing I have to say, this was grueling work for him. This was grueling work. Writing that monthly installment, and you had the old world and the new world dependent on you, and you had to get it out at a certain time. One of my favorite stories, it was one of the later novels. I don't remember exactly which one, but Dickens was late with the installment. And as often happens with writers, he had writer's block. He had a fertile imagination. It's amazing how much he created. But one month he was having writer's block and just couldn't sit down and get the next installment written. And he finally pulled himself together, realizing the time had come. He had to get this thing written, get it to the printer, and he was out of paper. So he went to the paper shop, which sold paper and also sold magazines and newspapers and the monthly installments. And ahead of him in line was a woman shouting at the owner of the shop, insisting that he had the next installment of that Dickens novel and just wouldn't sell it to her. And the man was insisting, no, seriously, if I had one, you think I wouldn't sell it? And Dickens is standing there about to buy the paper, knowing he hasn't even begun writing it yet. It's a wonderful story. It's part of what wore him down. Novel after novel after novel. There were a couple of times when he was writing two simultaneously, balancing one against the other. Then he began doing public readings of the novels. And he was apparently a magnificent reader of his own work. So he would do these reading tours, and people would show up by the hundreds, just pack halls to hear him read. He was warned finally as he grew older, because his health was deteriorating. He was born in 1812 and died in 1870, so he was only 58 when he died. But he was warned by his doctors he had to give up the reading tours. Well, he agreed to make another reading tour of America in the late 1860s. And his doctor said, okay, you're going, but I forbid you to read the final scene between Bill Sikes and Nancy and Oliver Twist. He would get so taken with that scene that he would become over-emotional to a point where it was clear he was doing physical damage to himself. He agreed, but got there, and everybody requested, and he gave in to their requests. It probably hastened his death. By the time of his death, he was such a master that he could keep the entire novel in mind. He used to make notes. There are notes in the back of this volume, his notes for Copperfield, how he sketched the book out. But by the end, he didn't even have to make sketches. He just held it all in mind. His last book is a murder mystery called The Mystery of Edwin Drood. He got exactly halfway through the book and died at the dinner table one night. There is not a note. There is no hint of how the plot was to be resolved. And of course, it stops smack in the middle of a murder mystery. There have been dozens of people who have tried to finish it, tried to guess the ending, but he took the secret to the grave with him. It's a magnificent story. Unfortunately, it's half a story, and it just ends there. Now, one other thing that needs to be said, and this is the beauty of tradition. If Dickens learned to be a novelist by reading Cervantes and Smollett and Fielding, then Dickens became the single most important influence on later 19th century novelists, particularly the Russians. We have from both Tolstoy and Dostoevsky that it was Dickens who was most important in teaching them how to write a novel. And they adored Dickens' novels. When Dostoevsky was in the prison camp for a while, he had a gospel with him, but at one point he got a hold of the Pickwick Papers and David Copperfield, read them over and over and over and over and over again. Just took them, and you can see it. There is the influence goes in very different directions, very different directions. With Tolstoy, you get the Dickensian element in the description of settings and the ability to convey a vast canvas and scene, and in Dostoevsky, you get it in the creation of character. The way in which there are these extraordinary, complex, deep characters. And often beginning the design by externals. It's a great gift. There are a number of others in terms of other British writers, American writers, French writers. Everybody read Dickens. Everybody read Dickens. He was hugely important. Now, how do we read Dickens? I'm going to make a claim here that's very important, because something serious has happened in a break for the first time since he wrote these novels between Dickens and the public. And the simple fact of the matter is, when I taught Tale of Two Cities last spring, it was the first time I had attempted to teach a Dickens novel in years, because I got such animosity from my students. Students now, quite regularly, whatever you assign them, will simply say, oh, this is boring. They don't like it. Read Moby Dick. How did you like it? It's boring. Read King Lear. Did you like it? It's boring. And that's just the standard response. You get used to it. My response is, no, that's a great work of art. It's not boring. Great art is a mirror. We find out about ourselves by looking into it. The book isn't boring. You are boring. It shuts them up for a while. But I would give them Dickens, and I wouldn't just get, oh, it's boring. I would get open animosity, real hatred, visceral hatred. I found it again when I taught Tale of Two Cities last spring. There were students in the class who would stop class, and I mean a couple of them good students, to express their detestation of that book. And they would give voice to an anger that was so profound. right of a piece with what had happened a few years ago and why I finally gave up trying to teach Dickens. Let me posit a reason why, because it goes to the core, I think, of what Dickens is about and why he is a great writer, and why, up until recently, everybody read him, and indeed, in school, you got Dickens, usually Great Expectations, Tale of Two Cities, as you went through high school. Everybody read these books. They're gone now. You wouldn't dare try to voice them. Well, part of it, they have long sentences with real words. That's part of the problem. It's not just like what movie would you like to see on Friday night, huh? That's, you know. But then that's true of other books have long sentences and words as well. Let me put it this way. My vision of Dickens' novels, and the reason they're so successful, is that what he is acknowledged as doing better than any other writer who ever put pen to paper, and we see it in this book, is his ability to convey childhood experience. It is by common consent a fact that Dickens was able to recreate what it was like to be a child living in the world better than any other writer. We'll look at some instances of it. It's a unique gift. The two greatest examples are in David Copperfield and Great Expectations. Classic. Nobody's ever done it better. But his novels are populated with children. Little Nell in the Old Curiosity Shop, Nicholas Nickleby, young Dombey and Dombey and Son, Joe in Bleak House. You go through the novels and you have this vast array of children, and they're real, they're believable. And they're most believable when we get inside their heads and we are seeing the world through the eyes of a child. This says to me, in some profound place in his soul, in his heart, and in his brain, Dickens never grew up. He was able to keep a part of his imagination childlike. And that is a very rare and extremely difficult thing to do. But it also means that he persisted in looking out on the world in childlike terms, and when he wrote his novels, even though they're massive, this is not a short work of art, okay? We've got in this edition close to 800 pages. What he was writing was a kind of fairy tale for grown-ups. And I think the best way to understand a Dickens novel and why a Dickens novel is unique and so popular is that they operate the way fairy tales operate. Now, in making that claim, I've got to define what a fairy tale is. It is a very unique kind of literature, very special. It is directed particularly towards children. But beloved by everyone, and fairy tales, of course, became one of the glues that held generations together. You would read certain fairy tales as a child. You would grow up, become a parent, a grandparent, and read the same stories to your children and grandchildren. It had offer that kind of coherence. Now, fairy tales basically are action stories. We have a young hero or a heroine who has to go out in the world, often forced out into the world, and often forced out into a world that is unfamiliar, unusual, and frightening. In a fairy tale, the child or the hero or heroine, let's say, sometime a young person, other times an older person, but nevertheless, the hero or heroine is forced to go out and confront things in the world. You cannot stay at home. The fairy tale assumes there is a world out there, and you have a part to play in it. Whether you want to or not, you're going to become part of the action of things going on out there. And it is defined very clearly in terms of good versus evil. The hero of the fairy tale is always a good guy. We sympathize. Same thing with the heroine, okay? Cinderella is forced to live not just with a wicked stepmother, but two nasty stepsisters as well. I mean, this is not a pleasant place to be. There is that sense that there is real evil around you, and the hero or heroine is good, but can only define that goodness in relation to what surrounds, okay? So there is no way the hero or heroine staying at home could ever discover that goodness. The goodness has to be learned through encountering the world which has evil in it, undertaking action where you have to line up on one side. You have to choose which side it is you are going to fight on, because the action always tends towards a fight. Now, in the midst of this, there is very serious danger. Fairy tales have a side to them of not just real threats and real danger, but very often real blood. And there is that sense of violence that can erupt. If you confront a giant in a fairy tale, you can't just run away from the giant. Jack the Giant Killer has to confront the giant and lop the giant's head off. That evil has to be taken care of, and taking care of the evil will often result in some kind of bloody end. There is no... which Grimm story is it? It's one of them where the evil characters have their eyes pecked out by birds. It's a gruesome vision. Hitchcock plays off it in his film, The Birds. But you have that sense. The evil characters are punished. They are severely punished. But before they are punished, they have presented a very real threat in that world. It's one reason that the early Disney cartoons work well. Disney understood that. The evil witch in Snow White is truly frightening. The moment before the magic mirror, where she goes from the beautiful wicked queen and transforms into that ugly, ugly crone, is a horrifying moment. And then the witch's ride when she's trying to escape in the thunderstorm. That's frightening stuff. Or Pinocchio being lost in the water and swallowed by the whale, being taken in by the whale. Those are and being there with his father in the belly of the whale and knowing it was his fault. He's the one who led his father there. Or something as simple as in Bambi, the forest fire, and then Bambi's mother killed by the hunters. There is real death, real evil, very real danger in fairy tales. It's an important part of them. However, the reason the child can put up with it doesn't close the book crying, and kids don't. Children have no trouble with this. It's the parents who say, I don't think that's appropriate reading for Janie. She's only 5. And Janie's turning the page to find out what happens next, right? Oh, man. Boy, I hope that wicked queen gets it, Janie, Because what's happening is the child's discovering moral order by reading these stories. And the reason the kid can read them and read them again and again and again is the one thing the fairy tale guarantees is that the good will triumph. You may go through a really difficult, frightening, terrifying, bloody, dangerous, deadly time. That's okay, the kid says. I can deal with that. Birds pecked out their eyes, they had it coming. But the princess is fine. She marries the prince. They lived happily ever after. Great. That's great. Read it again. Okay? Moral order asserts itself at the close, and the good triumphs. Fairy tales promise the child, yep, there's evil out there, but if you are good, fight the good fight on behalf of the good, persevere, then the good will triumph. And the kid says, yeah, okay, I can deal with that. I'm going to be the good guy. There was a desperate reaction against these stories, of course, when coming out in the late 60s, during the 70s. They were no longer read to children. They were taken off the shelves. They were gruesome. They were bloody. They were horrible. Innocent little children shouldn't be exposed to it. I mean, please. And what they replaced them with was all this touchy-feely crap. I had dear friends who were good liberals raising their 2 boys with that kind of sentimental, sloppy, let's all be nice to each other garbage. And those books were turned out. by the hundreds. They would not allow them to read fairy tales. They would not allow them to watch, the old westerns on TV. None of that. They sat the kids down, I'm not joking, this is horrifying, with little books called Transactional Analysis for Tots, which had stories in it about Susie and Bobby getting a candy bar and fighting over how they would divide the candy bar, and then deciding rationally the fair thing to do would be to get a ruler and measure the candy bar and cut it exactly in half, and they would share and each get an equal half of the candy bar. And seriously, this was the children's reading material. They would read this stuff, and the children would sit there and smile, and yes, and they'd be so nice to each other. And then the call came from the neighbors that they didn't want their children playing with these little guys anymore. And the reason was the little guys, yes, Mommy, yes, Daddy, will share, will be nice, would leave the house and do what? Just pound on the neighbor kids. They were out of control monsters. It's very clear what was going on. Children have an amazing aggressive streak in them. By the way, a non-sentimental, that's Dostoevsky and the brothers Karamazov. A great depiction of kids. And again, he got some of it from Dickens, but those kids are just, they're throwing rocks at each other. They're stabbing each other, hoping to kill each other. It's just, aren't the children lovely? I mean, Dostoevsky knew deep inside these kids was aggression. What do? You've got to channel that aggression somewhere. It's got to go somewhere. They're going to give expression to it. A famous psychologist named Bruno Bettelheim wrote a book, and it's one of the most important books of the 20th century, called The Uses of Enchantment, where he defended the fairy tale. And it's a beautiful book, a brilliant book, and thanks to Bettelheim, who explained all of this very clearly, fairy tales finally started being put back on the shelves and read again to children. There is a reason why, some of you know of my love for Roadrunner cartoons. There's a reason why the child can sit for hours and watch the coyote get beaten up and blown up and fall off the cliff. Yeah, that's aggressive stuff. But what's happening, we're talking just bare bones fairy tale kind of stuff there. The Roadrunner is innocent, decent, but very clever. And whatever the wicked coyote tries to do to get the Roadrunner quite literally blows up in his own face. And children sit there and will watch it. And my friends' children were not allowed to see any of that stuff. I was saying, you've got to give these kids Roadrunner cartoons. You can't grow up and not know the Roadrunner and Wile E. Coyote. Are you crazy? You've got to give them this stuff. Because it is channeling the aggressive impulse and it's defining good and evil. Now, Roadrunner, rudimentary. But fairy tales, very precisely, and often in a complex manner. And the case I'm making here is that Dickens' novels are fairy tales for grown-ups. You have the little boy heading out into the world, and it's a world of giants and monsters. It's a world of good and evil, and he's got to make his way through it. And it is often dangerous and threatening, and sometimes destructive and terrifying. But we somehow hold on to the hope that being good and eventually learning what it means to be good and taking action toward the good in the world, he will survive and triumph. That's it. And Dickens keeps that hope alive in our hearts as we read, which means when we come to the end, there's this wonderful satisfaction. Yeah. The good triumph. I'll talk about when I get to the end of the book, but I hope you notice at the end. All the good characters basically get to go to heaven together, except it's called Australia. You just get this wonderful business at the end where everybody goes off to Australia and lives happily ever after. And they get there and find some of the good characters we haven't seen for 400 pages who also turn up there. It's just like, well, these are the good guys, so they all get to be together. They all get to continue being good. They're all in each other's company. They all get along wonderfully. It's heaven, except it's Australia in this book. Artificial construction. It's absolutely delightful. But they've earned their way there. That is, they've all gone through tests and trials and proven themselves, and therefore they get to go there. And most of the evil people are punished, but this isn't just a fairy tale. We also have figures who are very good, who are sacrificed along the way. So we get complexity in the plotting. We get this is the next stage, if you will, for the child. Learning something else about the nature of life, that sometimes there are very good characters who take heroic actions and lose their life because of it. He will do that very often in one of his great novels, a disreputable, wretched character who takes one good action in his life and becomes heroic. A Tale of Two Cities and the story of Sidney Carton is absolutely magnificent, just magnificent. I had not read it or taught it in years. I sat down and read that ending again, and poof, wow, it's powerful. It is a far, far better thing that I do than I have ever done. It is a far, far better rest I go to than I have ever known. And the guillotine comes down as he lays down his life so that the woman he loves can be with her husband, that he's, oh man, it's good stuff. And Dickens can do it brilliantly. Now, what's the problem today? Quite simply this: the children are not allowed to be children. They don't have the opportunity to tap into that innocence, have a sense of defining a moral order, knowing what it is to take action in the world toward the good. They have no clue about any of that. The fact of the matter is, fairy tales have to be read to you by somebody, and they have to be read repeatedly. And it may be very nice if Miss Smith in kindergarten reads it to you and a couple of times, but it's not the same thing as sitting on Mummy's lap or Grandma's lap and having her read the story 1,600 times. The minute you finish it, read it again, Grandma. Read it again, Grandma. Mommy, won't you? Mommy, read it again. Go get a book and I'll read to you. Susie, we just read that book 30 times yesterday, but I like this book. This stuff is being ingrained in them and they know it. They're off to daycare. When they get home, they're plopped in front of the TV to watch just stupid, badly drawn cartoons with no point or purpose, no vision whatsoever. If you're putting your children in front of the TV to watch cartoons, find the Roadrunner, okay? But most of them just meaningless, senseless, pointless. And then, instead of moral formation, they're getting corruption. Age 5, 6, 7, their little friends are all dressing like creatures on MTV. They're yearning to show how adult they are, how grown up, to the point where you have 8, 9-year-old children who are dressing in an inappropriate manner. 8 and 9-year-olds. By the time they hit college, they've been corrupted in a profound way, and they don't know it. They're not aware of it. And you hand them a Dickens novel where there is innocence, goodness, evil, moral order, and they recoil from it like a vampire before a crucifix. They know there is something powerful there. There's something there they don't know or understand that's outside their experience, and they recoil from it. It is one of the signs that we have destroyed youth. That they not only can't read Dickens, as I said, they can't read anything, but that they loathe Dickens. Because what they're loathing in him is that which makes Dickens great. The innocence, the childlike spirit that he never lost and was able to convey in words, characters, and action right up to the very end of his writing career. I would just say that if you're around young children, go out and make sure they have the Brothers Grimm, Hans Christian Andersen, the Perrault fairy tales. Give them a solid diet of that. Read those stories to them over and over and over again. They're time-tested. They're wonderful tales. They are archetypal in many ways, but they are giving the children everything they need, and then you will also be preparing them in a way to begin the study of serious literature, because when they then head into Dickens, they're going to understand this world. They've been there before. It's familiar enough. It's longer, it's tougher, and there are surprises there, but they will be able to deal with it. And I sincerely think that Dickens is the gateway for finally coming to the greatest literature. Not that he's not great, but Dickens is preparatory for Shakespeare and Chaucer and writers such as that. He's preparatory. I do think you need to know him first. I'm not sure he possesses their absolute greatness, but what he did better than anyone else ever did. And he's an essential step in becoming a reader and someone who can appreciate literary art.